I have a great pleasure of being a professor of musicology and music theory. And in the course of preparing this program, it occurred to me that we're going to be discussing a piece that many are familiar with. However, I would humbly suggest that what we're going to be talking about goes far beyond the scope of what would ordinarily be introduced in a pre-concert lecture or in the sort of reading one would do if, for example, one were to read program notes regarding the symphony. So we're really going to dig into Symphony Number 5 by Beethoven. And I have to say that one of the great silver linings to this pandemic era has been the ability to connect with far-flung communities which would otherwise be impossible due to geography. And I'm sending my warm regards here from Fairfield, Connecticut, which is probably a couple of hours away from Madison, New Jersey. So it's great to be with you today. And I want to encourage everybody to certainly type any questions or comments in chat as we're making our way through the program. My preference is for a sort of an interactive format in which members of the community, that is to say, the folks who are on the call, can feel free to interject, as it were, but to keep things moving at a more flowing tempo, we'll put our questions and comments in the chat function. This way I can address them and take your questions and comments in real time, and therefore address them when they're germane to whatever's being discussed at any particular moment. So again, it's a pleasure to be with you today, and we're going to be talking about Beethoven's Symphony Number 5, a piece that is probably one of the most celebrated, famous, iconic, and recognizable works in the entire Western canon. And therefore a piece that I would suggest everybody on this call would recognize, at least the first movement. But we're going to be digging into the symphony and putting it under the microscope. And I'm going to make the contention right now as we start that Symphony Number 5 by Beethoven is easily one of the most important works in the entire history of the Western art tradition. Now, that's not news, that's not a surprise, and it's not a controversial or polarizing position to take. Most people, even those who are neophytes in the study of music, would understand that Beethoven's Symphony Number 5, being one of the most iconic works, checks that box. Today, I'm going to talk about why that is, why this particular piece of music has been ensconced in the repertoire, in the annals of history, so to speak, since it premiered on a very cold December evening in 1808, right around the time Beethoven was turning 38 years old. In fact, it took place less than a week after his birthday, and again, in a frigid concert hall at a time when there's no central heating, in a concert that lasted more than 4 hours. And yet when the orchestra got to the end of it, the audience demanded an encore. And that's sort of been the enthusiasm that this piece has commanded ever since. In fact, I would suggest that if we were to really do a survey of the usage of classical music across popular genres, that is to say in television commercials, in movies, in video games even, we would find that the Fifth Symphony is right up there in the top of this pantheon of pieces that are constantly used. The others, by the way, would include works by Beethoven like the Ninth Symphony, the Ode to Joy. I would suggest that the Fifth Symphony is a harder piece to analyze because it's purely instrumental. There are no words. It's not an opera. It's not a cantata. It's not an oratorio. It's not a song. If it doesn't involve vocals, if it doesn't involve a text, let's say a poem by a famous poet like Schiller or Rückert, or perhaps Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, or any of the other great German poets who influenced composers, we're dealing with instrumental music. And instrumental music is, on its face, very difficult to talk about. I often play a game with my students early in the semester where I'll ask them to describe a piece of music. And often what you get is, well, professor, it sounds nice. It sounds nice. Why does it sound nice? Well, this can be a very vexing question. Why does music sound nice? Many people lack the vocabulary, or at least the experience, to say, well, it has a very infectious rhythm. It has a very incisive melody. Oh, well, maybe if they really know music, they'll say, well, I love the way that the melody leaps up a perfect fifth before descending a half step. And they'll use intervals and sort of very kind of nuts and bolts descriptions to articulate what it is about the music they find compelling. We don't need to do that today, although I will be going into a little bit of what makes the music so recognizable and so gripping. We're also going to talk about what Beethoven was going through during this particular part of his life, namely the decade of his 30s, which was a time that marked both by his unparalleled triumphs in music. This is the decade where he's going to write the Eroica Symphony, number 3, his first breakthrough symphony. He'll write most of his piano concerti in this decade. He's going to write his violin concerto in this decade, the Sixth Symphony, better known as the Pastoral Symphony, the Choral Fantasy, his Mass in C. And the guy is just a dynamo. He's going to write his only opera of his life, Fidelio, in this decade. And yet, really, if we look deeply at his biography, we'll see that this is a decade where he really should have written nothing. Because he was in a state of profound decline in terms of his health and his mental health in particular. And so that makes the piece all the more miraculous. All of his music is miraculous in a way. The Fifth Symphony is especially miraculous. Let's go ahead and maybe we'll stimulate some responses in chat. What comes to mind when you think about Beethoven or the Fifth Symphony? I want to get a sort of foundation for what some of our members are thinking today. What might we talk about when we're talking about Beethoven in the first decade of the 19th century? How is music changing in this century? What was Beethoven's life like here? Feel free to put any comments in chat. Any comments at all? It's fine if we don't have any. We're here, of course. This isn't necessarily a quiz or pop quiz, I guess. Just taking the proverbial pulse of the room. Well, how about this? What do we know about Beethoven's health maladies? What was the main crucible of his life in terms of his personal health and mental health? I think many people will know the answer to this. It was his, yes, loss of hearings, Eliza, excellent. Beethoven went deaf. Many people have asked the question. Students perennially ask this question: how can a composer write music when they can't hear anything? The answer is very simple. Mozart was born with the greatest ear that humanity has probably ever known, and he kept that hearing his whole life. Beethoven was born with a similar ear, and he lost it. But the critical thing to understand here is that he was born with his hearing, and he lost it as an adult. His hearing probably started to go by the end of his 20s, his late 20s. We imagine that he started to lose his hearing. When you can hear from birth and you have really good ears, and in Beethoven's case, like Mozart and like Felix Mendelssohn and like Miles Davis for that matter, you have what's called perfect pitch or absolute pitch. You don't need a reference tone to understand what sound, what quality the sound would have. In other words, pitches have names like C major, D sharp, F sharp, B flat. We have chords like G dominant 7, D minor 7, whatever the chords are. Beethoven would not have needed to hear those chords out loud or those notes. He would have looked at the score and heard them the same way you and I hear them when they are performed out loud by an instrument. That's a pretty abstract idea. Many people have trouble wrapping their heads around it. And to be sure, it's one of the most poorly understood ideas in neuroscience as well. Neuroscientists have been trying to work on this. There's a wonderful author, and since we're speaking right now, thanks to the auspices of the library, I should shill a few books right now. If you want to read a great book about music and the brain, try Oliver Sacks's Musicophilia. And if you're looking for a great book about Beethoven that's sort of a more accessible read, I would suggest Russell Martin's Beethoven's Hair. So those are two books, and I can certainly put those in chat if anybody missed it just now. Two books that are well worth your time if you're interested in this. So Beethoven began to experience hearing loss. What is the typical response of an adult, a young adult especially, when their health begins to decline? I think it's fair to say that many people are in denial at first, right? It's like when we get sick and we don't want to go to the doctor because we imagine it will get better. And this was sort of Beethoven's attitude. He was also profoundly embarrassed because, after all, how could somebody pursue a career as a composer if they can't hear? Maybe that makes sense to Beethoven himself, but certainly the fickle and capricious Viennese, whom Beethoven held in a sort of scathing disdain, could not have understood it, and they would have perhaps been suspicious of him and accused him of plagiarism and so on and so forth. So Beethoven didn't want people to know he was deaf. And this led to him becoming something of a social recluse. He avoided conversations. He avoided scenarios where he would be forced to socialize and fraternize. He didn't have a social circle that involved friends and colleagues beyond a small handful of people. And in general, he avoided people when they hailed him on the streets, for example. And it wasn't until a couple of years after his hearing began to deteriorate that he wrote a document, essentially to his brothers, but really to the world, where he confesses his hearing loss and describes it. And it's one of the most heartbreaking documents that you'll ever read, any historical figure authored. It's really, truly heartrending. The reason is because Beethoven is sort of confessing his insecurities, not just about his present, but also his future. It ends, however, on a very hopeful and somewhat violent note. So we'll talk about that. First, let's consider Beethoven, the man. Here's a portrait of Beethoven that was done in 1820, just about 6 years before his death. Beethoven died in early 1827. This was painted by Josef Stieler in 1820, late in 1820. Here you can see Beethoven is holding a copy of his Mass in D, the Missa Solemnis. And a couple of things about his appearance, which are noteworthy. You'll notice he's not wearing the traditional powdered wig of the 18th century. Mozart is wearing a powdered wig in just about every portrait, but by the 19th century that had fallen out of favor. You'll notice here Beethoven's hair, which was famously described by just about everybody who met him in real life, commented on how thick and flowing his hair was. I guess this was in an age where men did not live to be particularly old in general, but if you did get to be Beethoven's age, he would have been about 50 in this picture. He certainly had a strong head of hair, I guess we would say later. It seems like a sort of irrelevant point, but actually it's a great boon to history that Beethoven's hair was so thick. And the reason is because when he died, in an era when souvenirs were impossible really to take in the form of, for example, a selfie or something like that. When you met a composer, often you would try to snip a locket of their hair. This was famously done to Franz Liszt, the Hungarian pianist later in the century. In Beethoven's case, of course, when he was on his deathbed, admirers and some students came by and snipped lockets of his hair. And one of those lockets survived and was forensically tested early in the 21st century and yielded some very interesting information, namely that Beethoven's hair had a very concentrated amount of chemical element with the symbol Pb, and of course that's lead. So this has led to the generally accepted scholarly belief that Beethoven died mostly from symptoms related to toxicity in his body, and it was metal toxicity, specifically lead. So could that have contributed to his hearing loss? Absolutely. Many people have made that contention, and of course it is backed up by the research and science. So here's Beethoven. Notice he wears a rather grim look on his face, no smile here. His eyes are set in a kind of ferocious concentration. When he wrote the Heiligenstadt Testament, which is that document I mentioned, he was about 20 years younger than we see in that portrait I just showed you. Let's take a look at that document. We'll talk about the document. We'll talk about the German language specifically. Here it is. You can see this is the official postage of the time. This was written to his brother, Karl and Johann. So Johann, the older brother named after their father, Johann van Beethoven. And in it, he basically says the following. He says, "You men of the world, how you wrong me. You think me to be a misanthrope. You think me to be antisocial. You think me to be a recluse. If you only knew what was going on in my heart, if you could only understand my deepest secret. What do you want me to say when I see you on the street? Shall I shout at you and say, 'Speak up, I cannot hear you, for I am deaf'?" He's really spilling his guts here, as a later generation would say. He's spilling his guts to the world. He's saying, what do you want me to do? What am I supposed to say? I'm a musician. My hearing is supposed to be better than an average person's, not worse. And now I'm reconciled to the fact that I'm going to have no hearing at all. Eventually, Beethoven scathingly criticized his doctors in the most biting and vitriolic terms sometimes. And it must be said that medicine of the late 18th and early 19th century was not a science the way it is today. To give you an example of that, by the way, when Mozart was sick in late 1791, before he died, he was bled profusely. They took away pints of blood, the idea being that they would let the vile humors out and balance out the four humors of the body. When that didn't work, they gave him emetics, which included black powder to ingest in order to act as a sort of purgative. To us today, this seems incomprehensible, but that was medicine, such as it was in Mozart and Beethoven's time. So of course, there was no cure for Beethoven's hearing loss, and he began to reconcile himself to this impending reality where he would become steadily more and more deaf. Why is this document so important? Well, first of all, it gives us a window into Beethoven's psyche in early 19th century Europe. It also tells us about his convictions, because at the end, what he says is, I resolve not to essentially give up my profession and take up something else. I resolve instead to seize fate by the throat. It's a very violent evocation, as I mentioned earlier, but that was the sort of firmness that Beethoven expressed when it came to his destiny, or the word in German is Schicksals. Beethoven is early in his life, this is in his early 30s, dedicated to the idea of pursuing his art and setting everything else aside. And this would really influence later generations of composers. The composers of what we would call the Romantic period looked to Beethoven and sort of worshipped him. They worshipped him in a way because he suffered so much for his art. And this idea of the starving artist, the artist who puts aside everything in order to pursue their art, is really associated with Beethoven. Beethoven never married, he never had children. He certainly fell in love, and he certainly pursued women, and he certainly frequented brothels, as most bachelors did in that period. But he suffered profoundly. His health maladies were not limited to his hearing loss. Beethoven suffered most of his adult life with terrible gastrointestinal illnesses, vomiting, diarrhea, bloating, cramping. It must have been absolutely debilitating, and of course also very embarrassing for him. So we think that Beethoven tried to soothe his belly by drinking cheap wine, and he would buy wine that was sweetened with lead acetate, and more lead, which was already in the pewter from the cups and plates and even in the piping of Vienna of that time, just hastened his demise. So it's really a miracle he lived to be 56. This is in an era where many composers don't live to see their 40th birthday. I mentioned Mozart, he died at 35. Schubert died at 31 from complications due to syphilis. Felix Mendelssohn died at 38 from an aneurysm or stroke. Chopin at 39 from tuberculosis. Robert Schumann made it all the way to the age of 46 before dying of complications related to bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. So this was a time when composers really suffered. And it seems that they sort of took their licks in stride, looking to Beethoven as their model, that they had to pursue their art no matter what else was afflicting them in life. It's kind of a very inspiring way to live. We would sometimes use the expression today, we might say they soldier through it or muscle through it. That was certainly the attitude, and a lot of it is due to Beethoven and this document, again, which is known as the Heiligenstadt Testament. Heiligenstadt, if you're wondering, is a suburb of Vienna, northern suburb of Vienna, and that's where Beethoven lived his adult life. Vienna was at that point considered the city of musicians. Mozart had lived there for a long time. Haydn lived there. Later on, Johannes Brahms would live there, Gustav Mahler, Anton Bruckner, and it wasn't just musicians. Gustav Klimt, the artist, lived there, as did Sigmund Freud, the psychotherapist, the pioneering father of psychotherapy. So Vienna in the 19th century, one could certainly make the argument, is sort of ground zero, not just for the arts, but especially for the arts. Let's do some listening, shall we? The Fifth Symphony opens with a very distinct rhythm. How might we describe that rhythm? Well, rhythmically speaking, in terms of the musical profile, we would say that it could be defined by a succession of 3 short notes followed by a long note. Ba, 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 bum, like that. Short, 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 long, short, 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 long. That succession is not something that just characterizes or typifies the opening gesture. Actually, it's everywhere in this opening movement. And what makes this symphony so remarkable is that it's everywhere in the entire symphony. Does anybody know how many movements a symphony has traditionally? I see some people holding up the number 4, and that's correct. A symphony traditionally has 4 movements, and that's true through most of the classical period and into the Romantic era. It's not universally true, of course. You could find early symphonies by Mozart and Haydn that only have 2 movements. You could even find late symphonies by people like Mahler that have 5 or 6 movements. But the number across an overwhelming majority is 4. And the order is, you have a fast movement, typically followed by a slow movement. And then the third movement is what we call a minuet or a scherzo, which is a sort of a form based on a dance. Typically, the minuet was associated with courtly aristocratic dancing. And then finally, we end with an allegro, that is to say, a faster movement, sometimes in a rondo form, that is to say, with repeated sections that come back and forth. For most composers, the first movement is undoubtedly the most important. It's where they really pump their creative juices into the movement, because it's the first thing we hear, and often it's the last thing we remember, or at least in this day and age where we've had recordings for about a century, it's the most iconic and recognizable of the movements. That's not always true, but it typically is. Again, if it's the first thing we hear, you know the old expression, you only get one chance to make a first impression. So the idea is the composer is going to really shape that opening to compel your attention as a listener. Let's set the stage. As I mentioned, it's December 22nd, 1808. It's a freezing concert hall, probably no warmer than 55 degrees inside the Kärtner Theater. Anybody who's ever been inside of a 55-degree building in the winter knows that it is miserable. Heinous is probably the adjective I would use. But nonetheless, the audience sat there in their coats for 4 hours while the musicians probably flubbed their way through a lot of this music because it was cold and because the music was very difficult for the time it was written. But the audience demanded an encore by the end because they probably sensed that what they had just heard was a kind of immortal and celestial music that would live forever. And so far, that prophecy has played out, and I believe it will continue to do so. The first movement is marked by that motto, that tattoo of 3 short notes followed by a long note. You can actually see that here on this color bar graph score. For anyone who hasn't seen one of these scores, these are sometimes called Malinowski scores, named after the pioneer of the software, whereby you plug the notes of the symphony in and it will render each of the notes on a different plane corresponding to tessitura. So the higher notes would be the violin, the flute, clarinet, oboe, etc. The middle notes would be, for example, maybe a cello or a bassoon. And then the bass notes could be double bass or perhaps bassoon, depending on what register it's playing in. So we get the rhythm and the notes represented here. And this is a great way for those of us who don't read music, which it must be said is most people don't read music. That's not anyone's fault. It's just an extremely arcane form of written communication. And this notational system ameliorates that issue for us. So we're going to listen to the first movement, not all of it. I want to skip around a little bit today. But we're going to be looking for that pattern of 3 short notes and a long note. Look for it not just in the higher instruments, but also in the lower instruments. We can already see 30 seconds in that the motto is everywhere. It bounces around from register to register. What I mean by register is how high or low the particular instruments of the orchestra are. We can see it prominently here in the melodic instruments, but we also see it in the bass instruments doing this sort of 5/1 cadence. Ba-da-ba-dum, ba-da-ba-dum, ba-da-ba-dum. You can hear it short, 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 followed by a longer tone. And more importantly, here we can see it playing out in this score. Even here, where it looks like a steady stream of notes, if you listen to the way the notes are grouped, it's still following that pattern of has that same pattern of really 4 notes at a time, a kind of short, 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 long. Although here, of course, the long note is truncated in order for the phrase to barrel forward. Let me just replay that little brief section. very clear from this void in the score that we've reached what we call in music a rest. And a rest is often a symbol of a mark of a point of repose, that is to say, the wrapping up of an idea, what we call a cadence. We're about to hear the second theme, which is going to be sounded in the French horn. Notice how the theme begins, once again, with that 3-note plus a long note. Da-da-ba-bum-bum-bum. Here, moving to the relative major key of E flat major. Notice, even though the melody up in the violins is very warm, very lyrical, very expressive, in the bass, we can still hear, if we bend our ears in that direction, the 3 short note, long note motif of that opening tattoo. Now, this is not a new piece for us today, but maybe just in that first minute and a half, and we will listen to more, maybe we're appreciating it in a new dimension. Maybe we're really appreciating the obsessive quality of that motif. What should we call this motif? Well, Beethoven himself seems to have given it its own moniker. Many years later, after he wrote this piece, he was asked by an assistant, a guy named Anton Schindler, and Schindler's testimony is reliably sort of questionable. He sometimes exaggerates and inflates his own role in Beethoven's life in order to make himself seem more important. But nonetheless, Schindler asked Beethoven, what's up with that motif in the Fifth Symphony? It's so insistent, it's so obsessive. What were you thinking there? And Beethoven supposedly smiled and said, that was fate knocking at the door. Remember, this is the second time today we've invoked fate. The first time was at the end of the Heiligenstadt Testament, where Beethoven said, I resolve to seize fate by the throat. What he meant by that, of course, was that fate had decreed he should be deaf, but he is going to show fate that he's the master of his own destiny. Here we can almost imagine that Beethoven is hearing that pattern over and over again in his ear. And it represents destiny calling, destiny knocking at the door. And Beethoven has to answer the door. He has to address the hand that Beethoven was dealt by providence, by fortune, however you want to describe it. And that's what we call that motif. It is referred to in the scholarship as the fate motif. Many composers have used the fate motif as a sort of homage to Beethoven. I'll give you one example. If you look at the very opening notes of Mahler's Fifth Symphony in C sharp minor, it starts with the same pattern. Da-da-da-da, that's how it starts in the trumpet, muted trumpet. That's just one example. There are many more. Brahms uses it in the finale of his First Symphony. Beethoven himself uses this motif in other pieces, namely, for example, his piano sonata in F minor, known as the Appassionata. So this motif of 3 short plus 1 long note is something that Beethoven will use in more than one piece, and other composers will use it as a nod to Beethoven, a doffing of the cap, so to speak. Well, if fate is knocking at the door, how can we imagine that Beethoven perceived the mood of this symphony? Again, a symphony is, by its very nature, an instrumental piece. And therefore, if it has no words, what's the interpretation of the piece? What should we possibly say about it? I think we can listen to something here which anybody can perceive, irrespective of whether you are a neophyte or a veteran listener. And that is that this piece, as the title suggests, is mired in the minor key. And the minor key historically is associated with, anyone? It's the difference, the main disparity between major and minor keys. Feel free to type it in chat. The major key tends to be associated with brightness, ebullience, triumph, and of course, great joy. And minor, as some have suggested here in chat, thank you for the responses there, is traditionally associated with lamentation, sadness, grief, despair. That is to say, generally speaking, negative things. It doesn't have to be that way, but it generally is. For J.S. Bach, minor keys are often associated with sort of the meditation on original sin, human frailty. In Bach's St. Matthew Passion, when Jesus is on the cross and says, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? The music turns to E flat minor, because for Bach that represented the key of deepest despair. For Beethoven, C minor tends to be a key of storminess, not sadness exactly, but great anguish, and maybe you could even say anxiety. And I think we feel that in this piece, don't we? That there's a sense of anxiety that the music's driving towards. Let's go back to the score and see how the next section, which is called the development, pans out. You'll notice it begins once again with that fate motif. I think it's clear we could tell from these long sustained notes that we've reached another moment of repose, or to use the musical lexicon, we've reached another cadence. This is the point in the symphony where we reach what's called the recapitulation, which is a fancy way of saying the return of the main theme. But listen to the wrinkle that Beethoven inserts in this particular moment. You'll notice the fate motif once again, absolutely peppering the orchestra. I saw there was a question to explain the notation. The colors in these scores generally correspond to pitches. Not always, but they often do. And the rhythms, of course, I think is self-explanatory, that the shorter notes represent shorter rhythms. And the tessitura is represented by the line being higher or lower in the score. So the flutes and violins will be in the top, and the basses and bassoons will be on the bottom. Notice what happens in this next section. By the way, these scores are sometimes called color scores, or Malinowski scores, Malinowski being George Malinowski, the pioneer of the software of that renders the notation in this kind of format. What we get next is absolutely bizarre and wholly unheard of in a recapitulation, really in any symphony. The band seems to strike up the familiar tune, but then they pause on a fermata. Fermata comes from an Italian word which literally means to stop, as in a fermata dell'autobus, a bus stop. And as the orchestra pauses, one instrument and one instrument only. Now, reminder, this is not a concerto where one instrument is supposed to be featured in a soloistic role. And that's not what this is, but it does constitute an anomaly in the symphonic form. The band cuts out, as the later generation would say, and one instrument sustains this mournful and doleful solo, which is over practically before it starts. Whisper quiet. Let's see if we can tell what instrument it is. Notice, by the way, even in this lyrical second theme, where the tune is passed around from the high winds to the strings, look at what's happening in the bass. This would be very difficult to detect if we didn't have this score, but it really is very apparent, I think, when we're watching the notes scroll by. Even as this legato and expressive melody, that is, has this cantabile, songful quality is in the top, we hear the sort of pitter-patter of that fate motif that hints at the gathering storm. In other words, the basses and the cellos have not forgotten about that fate motif, even as the other higher instruments are seeking for sunlight beyond the clouds. It seems that the gravity is binding us back to this unhappy fate. This is going to be an important imagery to keep in mind as we make our way to the end of the symphony. One more pause before we listen to the ending. I'm going to rewind it, and I wanted you to listen to this moment exactly, and I'll mouse over it when we get there. This could have very well been the end of the movement, and in Mozart and Haydn's day, it might have been. But if you look at the timestamp down below, you'll see that we still have 1.5 minutes to go in the movement. What that tells us is that Beethoven is tagging on a sort of a tail of sorts to the end of this movement. Actually, I chose the word tail deliberately because how do you say tail in Italian? Does anyone know? The word is a very common word in music because it refers to this sort of section, which is an optional section to end a movement with, and it's called a coda. Some of you rock and metal fans may be familiar with the Led Zeppelin album Coda. Coda just means an ending. So here's Beethoven's ending. Listen again, I'm going to rewind it just a little bit. Listen to how neatly they would have tied things up had Beethoven chose to end here. Instead, look what he does. Right there. Could have ended, right? We hear that. There's a finality to that. But the thing is, we're not in C minor here, and the first movement has to end in C minor because it has to start and end in the same key. Beethoven's now going to take us into a very robust coda. Beethoven's codas are famous for going well beyond what his predecessors ever conceived of doing in a coda. It's not an especially long movement, clocking in at just 7.5 minutes. Beethoven would go on to write much longer movements, but it is one of the most recognizable. And a lot of that, I think, is due to that insistent motive that just peppers the entire orchestra and flavors the whole sound of the movement. In fact, we're going to see that it's not just this movement, it's every movement. That's going to be very important to the narrative. Karen correctly identified that it was an oboe solo just at the beginning of the recapitulation. And that's worth just spending 30 seconds talking about, because in music history, composers tended to associate specific instruments with very specific affectations. So for example, for Baroque composers, trumpets, because they played in the key of D major, were associated with the most festive and ebullient of music. For Bach, anything of an eschatological nature, that is to say, music which anticipates the kingdom of heaven and sort of positive affectation of that nature, called for trumpets. The oboe had sort of the opposite designation. It was an instrument that, because of its nasal timbre, was associated with a sort of more plaintive tone, and therefore with lamentation. So it's not a coincidence that Beethoven chooses the oboe here as the solo instrument. We're going to skip the second movement, which is a lovely double theme and variations. We're going to go right to the third movement. The third movement is very significant. It's in the form of what we call a scherzo, and a scherzo is sort of a misleading term because the word scherzo comes from the Italian meaning a joke, a lark. There's not much that's humorous about this movement. In fact, I would suggest that it is one of the hardest hitting of the entire symphony, maybe second only to the opening movement. It too is mired in the darkness of the minor key. It's in C minor, back in the home key. The second movement's in A flat, if you're wondering. And it starts whisper quiet, pianissimo, with the low instruments rising slowly from the bottom of the orchestra to articulate something on the order of a gesture more than a melody. They'll repeat that before landing on an enigmatic dominant chord. And this is the setup chord, and you're going to hear it. After that, the horns take over, and they're playing in a very fast triple meter. Think of a waltz that's even faster than a typical waltz tempo. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, da pa 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 ya pa pam pam. That's our tempo. We're going to hear the horns playing a very recognizable tune here, but it's been completely warped to be accommodated by this new time signature, by this new meter and rhythmic profile. Let's listen to the third movement, and we're going to be looking at another color graph score for this. You can tell here that the beginning starts in the lower instruments because it is bereft of higher voiced instruments. They're going to come in a little bit here, but sticking mostly to a middle register. The colors represent tones. Blue is C, purple is G natural. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, that's what the colors are. The yellow is F sharp. Notice how quiet it is at the beginning. If you're inclined to turn your speakers up, just beware that the music is going to change dynamics radically pretty shortly. So have a listen. Did anyone catch that? It's going to repeat. So let's listen to it the second time through and see if we can make heads or tails of what Beethoven is sending us here. It's going to change keys here. We're in C minor here. We're going to be in E flat minor, so the colors will change. But notice this rhythmic profile. We can actually see it in the score. Ya-pa-pa-pam, ya-pa-pa-pam. It's that same short, 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 long, short, 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 long. It's the identical rhythm he used to begin the symphony and end the first movement. Ya-pa-pa-pam becomes ya-pa-pa-pam, ya-pa-pa-pam. In the beginning, it was in a duple meter. Yeah, pa pa pam pa 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 1 2 1 2 1 2. Here it's yeah pa pa 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3. It's the same profile. It's just been warped and shifted to accommodate the new meter. So Beethoven has disguised it, but not much. I think most people with a pretty good ear will be able to pick out that this rhythm is identical to the opening. And even if you can't pick it out on your own, hopefully today it's become apparent, because you're seeing it here represented in the color graph, and you can see that those rhythms correspond to the fate motif we discussed at length. I want to call your attention here to the flute line. This section is famous, or maybe I should say infamous, for its dissonance and intensity. Dissonance refers to the clashing and disagreement of tones that creates a yearning on the part of the listener to hear resolution. You're going to experience that whether you're conscious of it or not. As you listen to it, I want to call your attention to this flute part at the top. Notice the pattern here. Yap-pa-pa-pam, yap-pa-pa-pam. It's that 3 short notes followed by a truncated long note. It has the same quality. You're going to hear this, we called it a rhythmic tattoo. You could call it a motif. You could call it a fragment, a cell, however you like to describe it. Even in this movement, you can hear it clearly when the horns are playing it, but you can also hear it here in the flute part. Let's just backtrack a few seconds. Right here. All right, we reached another moment of repose, or again, we'll start using the musical terminology and we'll call it a cadence. What we get now is the section of the third movement that's known as the trio. You might wonder, why on earth is it called a trio? Does that mean only 3 instruments are playing? Not at all. What it means is that the texture typically becomes a little bit lighter. So here's the full orchestra. In the trio, you can see it just starts with the lower voices. So here, basses and cellos will play a very animated figure that's going to run up the scale, hold on a long note, and move off in syncopated fashion. Notice that Beethoven here is using what we call a contrapuntal approach, meaning that he's going to create independence with the voices so that they imitate each other, almost like a fugue, but not quite. Yes, okay, let's go on. Did you hear the imitation there? How when the upper voice came in, it plays the opening? Let me just rewind it. You're going to have 3 entrances here. Second entrance. Did you notice that cadence? Ba-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum. Isn't that a kind of inversion of ba-da-da-dum from the very beginning? Or ya-pa-pa-pum, pa-pa-pa-pum, pa-pa-pa-pum, ba-da-pa-pum. Here we go. Ba-da-ba-dum, ba-da-ba-dum, ba-da-ba-dum. It's that same pattern, and we can actually see it in the score. Do you see these 3 short notes which lead to a climactic tone? Ba-da-da-dum, echoed back and forth. We can see that they're staggered rhythmically. It's quite remarkable. The basses and cellos will strike up the tune again. Here is the little bit of Haydn-esque humor. You'll notice they'll try to strike up the tune, but they have to stop abruptly, almost as if they've goofed on the notes and they have to get it right. So he has them start and stop twice, and then on the 3rd time, they're off to the races because they finally get it right. Have a listen. Okay, we're back at the recapitulation of the tune. So here's where the opening material from this movement comes back. But notice how Beethoven manipulates it here. And listen for that dissonance and tension, which I mentioned earlier, is going to be the driving force. It's going to propel this next section. As we look ahead, we're going to see the tune spelled out once again in the upper register here by an oboe. I want you to listen for the timbre, the quality of the string instruments. Here, the violins and violas are not bowing their instruments. Instead, they're plucking. Does anybody know the term used to describe when strings are plucking where string players pluck the string instead of bowing it? It's a specific Italian word. Starts with a P. And there we go. I see a couple of us have it. It's pizzicato. Exactly. The quality of the pizzicato playing obviously makes it much quieter. In other words, you can't pluck a string as loud as you can bow it with the violin or cello or any bowed instrument. The bow is going to be generally louder. So the pizzicato sound is going to be a more delicate sound in some way. Let's listen to it and see if we can come up with another adjective to describe this manifestation of the tune. All right, we'll pause here. What did we think of the pizzicato playing there? Remember when we first heard that tune played in the triple meter, the Fate motif of the third movement, remember it was played in the horns and it was brassy and stentorian and bold. Here it's the opposite. The melody comes, it's passed around from the oboe and the flute and the violin, and the strings are plucking away in quiet fashion. I've always thought of this as being, if I had to describe it with one adjective, menacing, something urgent about it. There's something threatening about it. Remember, I used the analogy earlier. I said it's if a storm is waiting to break, or as if there's something beneath the surface that is percolating and bubbling to the top. We see exactly that happening in this next section. I would humbly submit to you that what we're about to hear in the next minute or so are some of the most important notes ever committed to parchment, ever written down via crow quill onto any manuscript. What Beethoven does here breaks quite a few rules. Number one, there's supposed to be a break between the third and fourth movement, and Beethoven doesn't give us a break. He, in fact, plunges and blows right through the end of the third movement and goes right into the fourth without any break, what we would sometimes call a musical bridge. What else does he do? He's going to start this bridge in a very fundamental, very rudimentary way. A sustained tone in the lower instruments, we can see that here on the bottom half of the screen, with timpani gently chirping along. And the timpani has played an important role here. Percussion in general plays an important role in Beethoven's music. We especially see that here. First, the timpani is just chirping along, mostly outlining that Fate motif, bum, ba 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 bum, ba 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 bum. So you can see that even bum, ba 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 bum, bum 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 bum, bum bum. The Fate motif is going to be articulated even in this quiet and very thinned out texture. Eventually, strings are going to come in and the violin is going to lead the charge. The violin will ascend before cascading back down. Yada ba da bim ba bim bum. Almost as if trying to break free, but being unable to escape the gravity of this rhythmic motif, which has been binding the symphony together in a kind of equilibrium. Finally, after bounding through several attempts, mostly in minor keys, we're going to see the color red here appear. And the red here represents the note E natural. For those of you with a bit of music theory, you know that if you're in the key of C minor and you have an E natural, that you're no longer in C minor because E natural belongs to C major. So there's this transformational thing that's happening. And you don't have to have a lick of music theory to hear it. What we hear is that there's tremendous tension. We hear the rhythmic motif of the Fate rhythm that's pounding away in the timpani. We hear the violin attempt to ascend before finally reaching up to the E natural and making it to the major key. The music becomes more and more tense, more and more fraught before arriving on a dominant seventh chord. And then what do we hear? Let's listen. pause there. As many of you have guessed, we are into the fourth movement. That bridge from third to fourth movement must have vexed listeners on December 22nd, 1808, when this was premiered. No doubt Beethoven was smirking as the orchestra charged headlong into that brassy fanfare that marks the opening of the fourth movement. You might have noticed looking at the score that the color palette changed completely when we got to the ending. The reason for that is because we are completely divorced from C minor at this point. We are now firmly in the key of C major, a key which, unlike C minor, is associated with hope, with ebullience, with a kind of triumphant spirit that Beethoven almost certainly meant to convey through this ending. What exactly happens after this? Well, the fourth movement is the longest of the piece, and we don't really have time to get to it. So what I'll say instead is that we get a fourth movement, which is an allegro sonata form, C major. And C major is so insistent that by the end of the movement, Beethoven is bombarding us one cadence after another to C major. So much so that it can almost be described as obsessive and over the top in much the same way that the Fate motif was described earlier as obsessive. What did Beethoven mean by that? I think to answer the question, we have to go back to the Heiligenstadt Testament of 1802 and ask ourselves what Beethoven was saying by the end. And just to reiterate, I think what Beethoven was saying was that despite his deafness, he was resolved not to take up a career as a painter or as a bricklayer or anything like that, but to continue to pursue music despite the odds being stacked against him. And this symphony, in many ways, is his response to fate, to destiny, to providence, to being cursed with this infernal malady of deafness, and yet turning around and deciding, instead of to hang up his boots and ride off into the sunset, Beethoven decides to scale the proverbial mountain, and much like Nietzsche's Übermensch of the coming century, to survey the sunrise from the other side. That's sort of the effect that it has had on listeners for the last 200 plus years, and I think the most common interpretation. There are others, and I invite you to share yours if you've got one, but I see we've got some questions in chat, and I invite anyone to put some questions in chat as we make our way to the end of the program. So Ruth asks, can I repeat the book titles about Beethoven? Yeah, I'm going to put them in the chat right now for everybody who wants to write them down. First book I would recommend, I'm going to put 3 in fact. Let's do Beethoven's Hair by Russell Martin. That's an excellent read, and you don't have to have a strong background in music theory or music history to appreciate it. It's about the determination that Beethoven likely suffered from lead poisoning based on the forensic testing of a locket of his hair, which was preserved for almost 200 years before it was tested in America, of all places, at the beginning of the 21st century. Another book about Beethoven is a biography by Jan Swafford, a colleague of mine who teaches at Northeastern University. And that book is called Beethoven, Triumph and Ecstasy, I think, something like that. Agony and Ecstasy, but that's a biography. And if I had to choose a third book about Beethoven, let's see. There are some really good ones. I would choose something that's a little bit more accessible. And the problem with musicological scholarship is that sometimes some composers will delve into analyses of various movements, and if they're using it, it can be a task. So I would start with those. Those are really the 2 books I think that will be helpful to those wishing to learn more about Beethoven. So let's go back to other comments. Anne asks, did Beethoven's hearing loss affect his choice of instrumentation? For example, did he choose percussion instruments like the timpani because he was almost certainly losing his hearing profoundly at this point? He had lost a profound amount of hearing. By 1808, was he completely deaf? Probably not. He probably could hear a little bit. Within a few years, we know he's going to be deaf because he's going to hang up his hat, so to speak, as a performer, which is how he made money for much of his career. He's no longer able to do public performances after 1811. So this is really the twilight of his career as a performer. It should be noted that Beethoven kept conducting after he lost his hearing, which is, you could say, well, isn't that inspiring? But the truth is, it's just sad. He shouldn't have done that, and it is sort of a stain on his record. And there are stories about him conducting so wildly that the orchestra musicians had to be told specifically to ignore him and to follow someone who was standing beside him or off to the side. The most famous example of that is the Ninth Symphony, which premiered in 1823 in Vienna in May. And some of you may know this story, but when Beethoven finished conducting, the orchestra had already finished. Beethoven got to the ending a couple of bars after they did. So there was a secondary conductor that they were told to watch. And it wasn't until the alto soloist, whose name was Carolina Unger, tapped Beethoven on the shoulder that he sort of opened his eyes and saw that the piece was over, and had to look behind him to see that the audience was cheering frenetically. So did it affect his choice of instruments? No, he wouldn't have needed to choose his instruments based on what was loud or soft, because he would have heard it all in his inner ear. And it would have been superfluous for him to, there are all these myths about Beethoven cutting off the legs on his piano. I don't know where that one started, or somehow putting his ear to the fretboard. There are advantages maybe when you're losing your hearing, but by the time you're deaf, that's not going to do anything. So most of it is apocryphal. Beethoven wouldn't have needed it. It's totally superfluous. He would have been able to hear everything perfectly in his inner ear, which sounds abstract, but every one of us has an inner ear. And you can prove this to yourself. Try to find some time in a quiet space, and without singing or humming or whistling, try to hear a very simple tune in your ear, Happy Birthday or the Star Spangled Banner. You can do it. Everybody can do it. And that's a great reflection of how the inner ear works. Great example, I should say. Karen asks, how do we watch a recording of this program? Danielle will have the answer to that question. And are there more colorgraph scores? Absolutely. You can find them all over YouTube. Music from the Renaissance and the Middle Ages, motets by Guillaume de Machaut and Josquin des Prez from the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. You can find postmodern pieces by Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, modern ballet by Igor Stravinsky, you name it. Debussy, Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun, Robert Schumann, Brahms, Wagner. You can find color scores for almost everything. Absolutely. So glad you enjoyed the program, Karen. Thank you. Any other questions or comments before we wrap up today?
To watch the recording of this, we're going to upload it to our YouTube. So I can send an email out to everyone that attended when it will get posted.
Fantastic. Thank you, Anne, for the very warm feedback. I appreciate that. And thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. This was a lot of fun. And I want to, just thank Danielle and the library for having me, because, I think are yearning, and maybe I'm waxing poetic here, but many of us are yearning for mental nourishment and stimulation. And thanks to libraries, the libraries really deserve credit in our communities for keeping the learning going over the last period. And that will be, I think, one of the great silver linings of this era, is that these remote programs, which are so convenient for many of us, will continue happening. So thank you to the library for doing that. Thank you to Karen and Peggy and Luis and Jim and Sue, who says, from a noob. I love that, Sue. That's great. I'm so glad you liked it. This was a pleasure. So I hope to see everybody at some point in the future. And until then, I will wish everybody a lovely day. Enjoy this warm, summery twilight of July as we make our way into the end of summer.